Good morning and a very warm welcome indeed to our first Movers and Shakers virtual event. My name's Natasha Salter and I'm Managing Director of Movers and Shakers. For those of you who haven't heard of Movers and Shakers, we're the UK's most prominent leading property networking forum. We celebrate our 25th anniversary this year. We're a family business and we take pride in connecting our members, generating opportunities and enabling them to win business. We're passionate about putting together the best speaker events. We hold a programme of events, conferences and the now famous property breakfast forums. I'm afraid we can't offer you a full English breakfast this morning, but I do hope that you have a nice cup of coffee or tea to hand. So we've taken the decision to postpone all of our physical events until September. So in the meantime, we've put together a programme of virtual events for you all. We're also making these free of charge and accessible to everybody to try and do our part to help the industry in these challenging times. So we've got a series of events, as I said. We'll be giving you Monday morning motivations to kickstart your week, a series of webinars, panel sessions such as the one today, views from the top, interviews with chief executives and leaders, and a series of market insights, keeping you up to date on the market. So this morning, it's our first webinar. The topic today is Back to the Future, a blueprint for planning and policy reforms. I welcome our panel. Thank you to them for joining us. Our guest chair this morning is Faraz, who is Director at Terence. We have Simon Gallagher, who is Director of Planning for the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. Simon will be able to put forward the ideas in the recent Planning for the Future report and also give the government's intentions. Joining him, we have Claire Dutch, who is partner at Ashurst, Deirdra Armsby, who is Director of Place Shaping and Town Planning at Westminster City Council, and Rebecca Taylor, Managing Director for Long Harbour's multifamily build-to-rent business. Again, thank you to you all for joining us. So how it's going to work this morning? Well, Faraz will be fielding questions to our panel. That will last about 45 minutes. If Faraz keeps to time, he does know we can actually mute him today. In all seriousness, we've got a Q&A tab on your screen you should be able to access. Please ask questions. Our panel and our chair will be able to see the questions and they'll do their very best to answer them in the given time. So that's all from me. Thank you very much indeed for virtually attending today. I'm going to hand you over to Faraz and our panel. Thank you. Enjoy.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Movers and Shakers, and good morning, everybody. Terence is delighted to partner on the first webinar with Movers and Shakers on what you would expect me to be doing anyway on an issue around planning, which, as many of you all know, saw a number of reforms announced just post the budget, and we will focus on some of those reforms this morning in the 45-minute session that we have with our panelists, and indeed yourselves out there in the internet world, using the Q&A question tab as we go through the discussions. But what I thought we'd do, which I'm sure many of you in the industry, both in the public and private sector, would like to do more so right now, given the climate that we're in, is perhaps discuss a little bit and invite Simon not just to talk about the Planning for the Future paper, which many of you will have seen a briefing note that we sent through alongside the invitation, but also alongside that, perhaps also ask him to give us a quick run through of some of the sort of insights that he will be thinking around on the emergency measures, I call them anyway, that we might want to consider as a sector. And I know Simon has been receiving a number of comments and papers from the sector about ideas, but perhaps this is an opportunity for us to first kick off without inviting Simon to tell us a little bit about some of those thoughts around emergency measures that could be brought forward, and then indeed perhaps a landscape around a broad introduction on the Planning for the Future paper. So without further ado, over to Simon. Simon.
Faraz, thank you very much, and greetings everybody from sunny South London. And thank you for allowing me to beam myself into your houses today. Thank you, Faraz, for also suggesting us talk about the current circumstances, because I think that's the most important place to start, really. Look, the reality that we have heard from MHCLG is that in the wake of some of the social distancing measures and closures imposed in England, that planning really ground to a bit of a standstill. Most of local government suspended holding decision-making meetings. The planning inspectorate did likewise, and construction work on sites has pretty much ground to a standstill, with the exception of my next door neighbour. So if you hear banging and things, there's something going on anyway. And our priority in MHCLG has been to sort of see what we can do to restart that process. So what we're trying to do is to strike the balance between restarting the decision-making process so that we can get those decisions flowing, but also recognising that local government has an important role on the front line for COVID-19 response, whether that's in local resilience forums, supporting social care, whatever it is. Local government is under real pressures at the moment, and local government needs to be able to do that, which is key part of its national response. So what we've been doing at the MHCLG end is trying to find a way of squaring those circles, and we've done, I think, 2 or 3 things so far. The first has been a number of permitted development rights. We introduced something last week which allows some temporary land use for NHS and local government in responding to the crisis, which I think is an important response. We've also done some work to enable some restaurants to operators takeaways in the current environment, which is essential really to get that in critical short-term development moving. The second bit has been trying to facilitate local government to be able to make decisions again by helping to get decision-making through virtual committees and to get new models of operation there. We've passed the regulations, but it's down to individual local authorities to find a right way of doing that. A number of local authorities have moved well ahead of us, as ever, and some are still trying to work out how to use that. And I think the next priority for the next few weeks is to just get that operationalised in all local authorities. And the third bit we've been doing is a bit of short-term practical measures, like, for example, there were a number of neighbourhood planning referendums which were due to take place in the current weeks, and we've been deferring those to create to save local government that pressure. So there's been a lot we've been on, but we are not yet at the end of doing things, and I certainly don't think that we have done our job yet, and there's more for us to do. I think there's 3 things which I would put forward to as areas where we're really conscious that more thinking and work needs to be done. The first is, of course, the planning inspectorate. A number of you have expressed concerns about the pausing of some of those hearings and inquiries, and are making a good case that such work could carry on being done remotely. I think that case is made. I think there's just a lot of practical stuff for the inspectorate to do. Some of you will have seen the excellent podcast they have put out about the work they're doing with the Planning and Environmental Bar Association, but I think we need to bring that work forward quickly so that the work gets done quickly, and so we are working closely with the inspectorate on that. Second thing is, there are a lot of individual issues we are hearing from local authorities about practicalities around decision making. You know, how do you do a site notice at a time like this? How do you do consultation requirements? I think we are working with local government on those, trying to work out, make sure that we've got all those bits and pieces in the development management procedure regulations, and we know what we need to do about all of those. Some are fixable, and I think I can see ways through them. Some of them are really tricky, but we are working through all of those as we look at. And then the final bit is, particularly with an eye to the recovery phase, we are conscious that there are a number of representations that we have received for ideas which are things which are essential to get planning able to support the economic recovery as we emerge. You know, one of the top ideas I've heard a lot about is the worry that planning permissions are going to expire in the next couple of months, and that people will have to go back into the process. Those of you who are legally minded will know that that isn't an easy one to fix, because there are various statutory constraints on that. We are very well aware of those and are looking at there. Our friends north of the border are putting in a bit of primary legislation to fix that. We're in close conversations with them, but that is definitely on my list of issues that I have heard loud and clear from the industry. I think we've also heard a number of issues about practicalities around, for example, community infrastructure levy payments and when those might be triggered. And I think we've still got to do a little bit more to understand the precise nature of the problem and the issues around that. But those are sort of questions we are hearing as well. And there's a number of further ones. And really, I'll probably pause for breath there before I get on to the planning for the future side of things. But I want to reassure you that we've done a lot, but we do not regard that as a job done. One of the things we are thinking about is our communications with the industry. We're working very closely with our friends in the Local Government Association and the Planning Advisory Service, but do we need to do a bit more communications? And we're thinking about that. And we've been trying to balance the question between putting out a whole load, which means you move at the pace of the slowest item in that, or getting bits and comms out there as soon as we can, and it looks a bit bitty. I think we've been doing more of the latter, so I accept it looks a bit bitty, but I think it's been priority is just getting on and doing stuff, which helps unblock the decision making. So for us, I'll pause there.
And we'll talk about, we'll give you a moment later to talk about the planning for the future of it, but I think you're right. Let's just sort of unpack some of those thoughts that you've outlined as sort of agile measures in the way the planning system can operate in what is a tough environment at the moment. And perhaps maybe if I sort of point to Deirdra, because Deirdra, you're at the coalface of running a planning service right now. And listen, we thank you for your frontline service, you and your team, for all the efforts to keep the city running. But obviously, you know, thinking about that planning decision making in a timely fashion, keeping the sort of motor running. From your lens, hearing about what Simon's just talked about some of the measures that he's hinted at that are being considered and some that are in play for local government to utilise, perhaps you could give us a sense from where you are of how this can work for you. Good.
Yeah, I mean, thank you everyone for joining in this morning. And I think what we have all shown is, you know, a great deal of agility actually across local government, both in dealing with that immediate human need that has fallen to local government to deal with, and making sure that our people are safe and well, and that communities get what they need from us. So outside of that, some of our crucial services have, you know, adapted really quickly to this, you know, very changing circumstance. So in terms of planning, we, I think at Westminster and a number of other authorities were particularly well placed. We have agile working, we're all equipped to work from home and have been for the last sort of 2.5 years. We have a system that with the onset of the new regulations around virtual planning committees, we're able to operate. We don't have to get new software, get everybody to know how to use that. That's all in place for us. So we have been particularly well equipped to take up these very fast moving measures that have come out of MHCLG day by day. And I think we have our first virtual planning committee this evening, and that's something we're really excited about, because I think some of the things that we will do now in a response mode will also be things that are legacy for the future, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in a little while. I think the measures that have come forward so far, the emergency changes of use, if you like, to enable the response, is really spot on. You know, it's exactly what we needed, and everyone will operate within those new and much more flexible parameters. And I think some of the guidance and regulatory wording has been particularly well crafted to be as flexible as possible. I mean, that's not necessarily everybody's cup of tea, but I think when you have to move fast, you have to know that you've got a good bedrock of doing it properly, but you need that flexibility to be able to work on the ground. So we're very pleased so far, so good with the measures that have come forward. I think the things that Simon has picked up around planning permissions expiring and what's happened in Scotland to enable some of those things that are really coming up against it now with expiring permissions is definitely something we're beginning to hear more and more of on a daily basis. I mean, obviously we have powers with regard to new applications where we could actually move forward into elongated permission period. It all depends on how long we think all of this may last. So there are things that we can do now, and I think we shouldn't necessarily rely on new regulation because all of that's time consuming. And I think the things we can do within our existing powers, we've got to be much more creative about, and also somewhat risk averse for the future. So I think the time scaling thing for us is a big thing, you know, the 8 weeks, the 13 weeks, the prior approvals, those things. I think a lot of local authorities have been very concerned about that if they can't get to a prior approval within the relevant period, that, you know, there's auto planning permission there and that may have long-term effects. So I think MHCLG have indicated that they will be relatively flexible around that, but, you know, recovery requires development. It requires a better built environment for all of us. And I think some of the things we do now, we don't want them to be counterproductive to the recovery situation that we will inevitably find ourselves in. So it's good. I think the timescale, statutory timescale issue is perhaps something that we could focus on in the next few weeks to assist local government carry on with its business. But actually, local government has done a tremendous job. My peers across local government in London in particular have really kept their planning services, you know, on the road. So I think that's something to be very proud of, and we really are pushing ahead with our decision making, because unlike perhaps some other services in local government, if we don't do the work we have in our pipeline, it will still be there for the future, and that's going to be a difficult thing to manage. So we really want to do as much as we possibly can in the days that we're in order that we can get to a much more positive place for the future and not be looking at backlogs, etc.
Indeed, many will say in the private sector it's about also trying to keep that service open. It's good to hear you've got your planning committee going on tonight, Deirdre. Equally, though, there are challenges where reports from some elements of the market are saying, look, we're trying to put applications in. The authorities are not prepared to validate those applications to get the clock ticking. And we need pragmatism across the board, because invariably that clock can't be as rigid as we've had it in previous times, but we do need the basics of validation as well. I don't know, Claire, just turning to you for a moment. We heard about the challenge of expiry of planning permissions. We've heard about the intimation of looking at maybe how the SIL might be reviewed under the current circumstances. From your lens and from your client base that you're talking to, what are the sort of measures that you think would be helpful here and now and as part of the recovery for Simon to consider?
Thanks, Faraz. Well, I take my hat off to those boroughs who are really trying to work around this problem. I mean, we've seen a heroic effort from a lot of local authorities, but just picking up on some of those issues, non-validation, we're seeing that quite a lot. Understandably, local authorities are worried about the clock ticking. They're worried about consultation, they're worried about site notices. I think it'd be helpful for the government to remind local authorities, perhaps in another Chief Planning Officer's letter, that validation is a separate thing to what happens next. And many of our clients, the developer clients, are under contractual obligations to get a planning application in and validated. They want it in. So providing a local authority has got the documents in order, they've got the fee, they should go ahead and validate. In terms of the clock running, now I think our developer clients are accepting that this is an unusual time. They accept it's going to take time, and they are happy for the determination period to be extended. And just remember, you don't have to extend a period under some fancy, lengthy, drawn out PPA process. You can simply do that by an exchange of emails. So I think it's developers working with local authorities, keeping the system moving. I was very encouraged to hear from Simon on the implementation issue. This is a biggie. Developers do not want to lose their hard-fought planning permissions. And I would like to see some sunset provisions coming into the law, similar to 2008, 2009, but perhaps making them, like Scotland, and I think Ireland's done the same, making them automatic. So, for example, permissions that are going to expire in 2020, they are automatically extended by 6 months or a year, and this will relieve the burden on local authorities of continually having to deal with these applications for extensions, because it will happen automatically. But what we have been looking at is, we accept that's going to take law, and it's going to take time. So what we're looking at the moment with our clients is, how can you use the current legislative process to extend the implementation period? We know we can't use Section 73. We know Section 96A is dodgy at best. So we are looking more closely at Section 97, which allows a local authority. Sorry?
When you say Section 73 and 96A, just for those that are not planning to, like we are, just explain.
Yeah.
Are there any such people on this?
We're all planner racks, aren't we? Section 73 is commonly referred to as amending a planning condition on a planning permission, and the law specifically says you can't amend the condition which extends the implementation period under Section 73, unfortunately. Section 96A is making a non-material amendment to a planning permission. It's arguable whether extending a period of implementation is a non-material amendment. So those aren't ideal scenarios. I think until new law comes in, we have been looking at Section 97, which allows a local authority to modify a planning permission. It's a bit fiddly. Sometimes the Secretary of State has to sign it off, and we do know the Secretary of State has signed it off in the past for this very purpose, but unopposed applications for this, unopposed orders, do not need Secretary of State sign off. It's not ideal, but it's a way of keeping these permissions alive until new law comes in. Final point I'd like to make is Section 106. We mustn't forget the wretched Section 106. Many of our clients are now worried about viability reviews kicking in because they're not on site doing enough of the works, the requisite amount of work to stop a viability review. They're worried about annual payments, having to keep paying money to the authority when nothing's happening. I would urge the government to issue a similar letter like Steve Quartermain issued last month, where he urged pragmatism for LPAs on the enforcement of conditions. I think a similar sort of letter on Section 106 enforcement would be helpful, pending deeds of variations being entered into, which is going to take time.
And what that is saying is a key message is that for developers right now, cash is king. Having the ability to have the cash flow to keep the operations running. That's not to say to not pay their dues, whether it's SIL 106 or any other requirements for infrastructure, for local infrastructure provision. I think right now it's to maintain the ability, particularly for small, medium-sized builders who are operating at a much more reduced scale. They will want to make sure they can retain as much cash in the bank to be able to do their operational business on a day-to-day. And let's not forget, while construction sites are still operational today, one of the biggest challenges outside of planning is the supply chain. But a conference for another day, perhaps. Perhaps, aptly, maybe I could invite Rebecca. We've heard a variety of measures that have been introduced by MHCLG, what they could have said. But from your lens, what do you think, and particularly because you're operating from a BTR lens, a build-to-rent lens, Rebecca, what do you think you've heard so far gives you some comfort, and what other things would you like to see added to the list of measures that Simon could take away with him as he scribbles away? I can see on my screen.
Look, I mean, again, I commend as did Claire and Deirdra in relation to lots of local authorities' ability to kind of mobilise and get on with things, much like the rest of the market has. I think I don't know about everybody else, but we seem to be busier than ever in terms of all of the communication. So I think the local authorities that we're working in at the moment specifically have reacted quite well. We were in the process of signing a Section 106, and that was only delayed by a week. And we're looking at putting a new planning application in in May time, and the communication is business as usual, and we're open for business, which I think is a brilliant thing. I think the main thing, and I think just to echo what Claire was saying, is really just the communication piece. I think over the next 3-6 months, communication between all parties is going to be essential in making sure that you're not being bombarded unnecessarily, but that we can get things processed. I think from our side of things, we always saw build to rent as a counter-cyclical product, in terms of we're not related to sales or mortgage markets or anything like that. So for us, I think we see this as an opportunity to, as business as usual, and to keep delivering and get ready to start on site when the market does return to normal and construction can commence. So I think for us, I think the support really will be around communication, and obviously in the recent planning reforms there wasn't any mention of build to rent at all. So I suppose that the main ask is that there's some recognition for build to rent. I think it provides an essential need in the market. It's really interesting to see at the moment how institutional investors are responding to COVID, in terms of customer requests on paying rent and keeping sites safe and staff on site. So I think there'll be a lot of lessons to learn from the benefits of build to rent as we go into the next 6 months as well, when you compare ourselves to other private rented sectors or other parts of the market.
And of course, I will give you your chance at the bite of the cherry to talk about the Planning for the Future paper and its absence of BTR in there. But I'd like to still stick on this emergency measure point, because I think, Deirdra, you've heard from a selection of people here around what they like to see, particularly from Claire and Rebecca. Are you seeing the developers knocking on your door, talking to your teams at this point in time? Is there an engagement happening in a productive way, or has that are you having to restart that because obviously things have sort of been more involved on the frontline services of other more important things? But has that communication flow been happening between your teams and the development community over the last few weeks? And what's that looking like?
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely has. I mean, obviously it looks and is very digital and virtual. And we've even also had a lot of the developers, shift across into digital consultation tools where that's appropriate in the part of the system that they're in. So obviously that's mostly applicable in that pre-app world, and the work that developers do at that point. So there have been quite a lot of conversations around that, about what will count as genuine, authentic consultation, given the phase of development or in the system that they are. But we've very much tried to facilitate that, and we had some examples of it happening prior to the the crisis that we're in at the moment, where 6 months ago people were starting to use, in that pre-app world, a lot of digital micro sites to explain and clarify their proposals, and that they have very good reach in localities, again by using sort of data analytics in local areas and so on and so forth. So I think that is a really big piece that will get bigger, and it will get bigger faster when we start to emerge out of this. But on a daily basis, they're absolutely on the telephone, video conferencing, we're facilitating that across the board. We've had some really good plaudits from our applicant community about how we're dealing with that. So that's all to the good. I suppose there are groups who find it a little bit more difficult, but they are probably largely in our community applicant group. And I think one of the things that we are very conscious of is how we bring the communities with us as we move forward in the measures that we put in place. So, for example, the whole debate around SIL and Section 106 deferment, of course, on the whole, they are the community benefit package attached to planning permissions. And I think we'd all have to be very careful to ensure that, they're not the things that appear to be, pushed to one side first, because they're intrinsic to why planning permissions were granted. That's not to say that the way those benefits flow out into communities won't have to, look at some modification. We completely understand that. But I think it would be very dangerous if they're seen in some unseemly fashion to be jettisoned first, because they are the things that, enable development to be acceptable to communities. And we must keep that faith and that confidence with the communities when we move forward, because we may well be in systems, I think, for recovery that are much more fleet of foot and trying to be flexible. And some of that will be about taking communities with us faster to do the things that we need to do. So we must keep their confidence in this period.
And Deirdra, I think I'd second that, and on the basis that, you know, from our side of things, I appreciate smaller developers or investors may have different issues with cash flow or kind of timing of that. But I think at the moment, especially from a build to rent perspective, you know, we're long-term investors who are looking at communities for 10, 15, 20 years. So, you know, we you know, there's other measures, you know, on the long-term investment horizon that we can look to that maybe promotes the delivery of faster you know, housing delivery or starts on site. And obviously that, you know, the SIL and the Section 106, for us, it's intrinsic to make sure that that stays in place and that we can see actually that the communities are benefiting from that, you know, as opposed to developers deferring it, or even, you know, at the end of the day, if they get smaller, then it's not really the investors or the community that benefit, it ends up being the landowner. So I think, you know, protecting SIL and looking at other measures, as I mentioned before, you know, once we come out of this, you know, incentivizing people to start on site earlier, you know, maybe through abatements, through SDLT or the like, so that, you know, if you start within a year or 6 months of your planning permission being granted and you deliver within a certain period, that there's refunds available on that SDLT. And I think that's a better, more holistic way to look at cash flow for developers, rather than, you know, as you say, affecting the community and what's going to be an interesting time over the next 6 to 12 months.
Claire, I never thought I'd hear anyone talk favourably about SIL, actually, and I'm a little taken back by it. But, you know, I'm told cash flow is the issue here. But some of these ideas seem to be, there's an issue of presentation for sure. I think Deirdre's made a very good case about that. Rebecca's talked about other forms of tax that could be deferred. You know, from your, just before I sort of come back to Simon to give a sort of wrap up on what he's heard there and introduce the planning for the future paper. But from your perspective, you know, if you had to have one key area that needed to be responded to, what would you ask that to be around, sort of in terms of monetary cash flow elements, you know, on the balance of what we've heard so far?
Was that directed at me, Faraz?
Yeah.
Sorry, I missed the first bit. Do you know, SIL is a funny one, because on the big schemes, most of our clients are clever and they phase their SIL liability. So it allows them to start the first phase, commence the development, implement the planning permission, and actually do the first phase, which is usually demolition, without paying SIL. Where we're seeing problems now is I've got 2 big schemes at the moment which cannot progress to phase 2 because the SIL bill is literally 12 million, 15 million pounds. We're talking about big chunky pieces of money. So I think a look at SIL, I don't think SIL necessarily is stopping developers getting on site and implementing. Other factors are stopping that, obviously COVID or whatever. But what SIL is impeding is progression. And when the market picks up, it's whether those schemes are still viable to stomach a 15 million pound SIL bill to actually make more progress than just a technical implementation. And I think something around in the SIL regs about exceptional circumstances relief being switched on automatically, maybe just for a temporary period. I think that issue does need to be looked at.
And I think, Simon, you know, just turning to you now, I think there is I think Deirdre's got a valid point about presentation. I don't think anyone's saying that those payments shouldn't be made. It's how and when they're made. But I don't know. Look, you've heard an array of views here as part of the sort of measures that we'd like to see come forward. From a quick wrap up on that, what was your take on some of those points you've just heard?
So I thought that was a really helpful discussion, and thank you very much for everybody for those. I think I take away 3 or 4 bits. One is that the implementation really matters. I think there's a really interesting story from Deirdra of what they've been able to do in Westminster about getting themselves up and running, moving quickly. They have the technology in place. There are other authorities who don't have the technology. who don't have the councillors who are ready to do this, and that implementation phase is going to be really important, and we need to make sure that everywhere can get up to the sort of performance as that Deirdre's team are. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is I do take away, and I think a number of you have mentioned this, some of these points about validation, timetables, the way in which that engine room of the decision-making process works, that we just need to keep a bit of an eye on that. And I think there's been a few practical things there. I think the point about validation is a really interesting one there. I think this point, I think it was both Claire and Rebecca have made it about pragmatism in enforcement is a really important area. So to reassure you, one of the first things we did in the downturn was actually, and we got into the COVID process, was actually issue a written ministerial statement urging pragmatism on enforcement of conditions around supermarkets and deliveries there. This is exactly the space where we are in. I think it's really important territory. I think that just the practicalities of this is actually what we speak to developers is they don't want they want a bit more certainty than a sort of bland sort of departmental statement that says, please be pragmatic. And so there's a real question for us to think about on that one. And then the last bit, I'd mentioned SIL and I've taken away, and Section 106, and I've taken away from this conversation that I was right to mention that. You're stiffening my spine that there is an issue there. Precisely what the solution is not straightforward. And I think it's really, really important that anything is really about phasing and timing rather than absolutes at the moment. We're talking about precise timing. Local authorities can't get on with spending the money is what we hear, because they can't actually get on with doing some of the works that the SIL would have funded. So how do we work our way through that? I think that's really interesting and profitable territory for having a look at, and just to remind people though, just of the sort of slight constraints on us, if I want to change the SIL regulations, those are affirmative regulations which have to be approved by Parliament. As Claire was saying earlier, some of the things about automatic extension about planning permissions, well, we might be able to do something a little bit through creative use of the regulations, but if you want to make this properly automatic, actually we need some new primary legislation. So I just need to manage a bit of the expectations on that, because we work in a very regulated system and I need to operate within the law.
I want to touch now, because I've got 15 minutes, and I want to touch on the Planning for the Future paper. Now, many of us will have received the briefing note of the sort of 10 key areas that it covers. Perhaps, Simon, what I'd like you to do for us is touch on sort of, given where we are with the way of the world, where do you think the timetabling for some of these things will be? We've had questions coming in from people like Ashurst from Airspace, wanting to know, from a PD upward extension position, is that still going to come through in the summer?
Yes.
Dan makes a really good point. Danny Kay, he talks about the plan making. As we all know, planning and viability has been something that we've started to see in local plan making as part of a requirement. How does that work now, given obviously values are very different in a market where probably those viabilities and plans that were made were in a different world? So perhaps respond a little bit how that works in the real market. And then we've had a broader question from Paul Smith as well, talking about PD, his concerns over the sort of standards of product that come out of it. Of course, the Planning for the Future paper touches on more muscular PD coming out for the planning system. So perhaps a bit on the time scale, a bit on some of those provisions, just to answer some of the questions we've seen come through. And perhaps the other one was, and as I point to look at Deirdra and her colleagues, there is this push for performance of local authorities, particularly in local plan making by 2023. Are those things now shot in the water because of where we are? Just your views on planning for the future, perhaps, at a headline level.
For us, I could talk for 40 minutes on this, so I will keep it mercifully short, not only to ensure that my fellow panelists earn their crust as well today. First thing to say, this is a serious paper. This is not something which MHCLG produced in 10 minutes, but junior side of things. This was a serious piece of paper which involved quite a lot into Whitehall discussion. So, I'd use it, you read it with those context. And just a bit of history. So when we started on this work, we were talking about a accelerated planning green paper, because what we had diagnosed and heard extensively was that the principal problem with planning now was the pace at which decisions were getting made, and some of the challenges in the engine room of decision making in not all local authorities, but certainly some local authorities, and we weren't just getting the right pace of decision making. And there was there was something we needed to do to get faster decision making, but probably more resource, seniority, and capability into local government. And so we have not lost that, and that, I think, it remains a key part, and you should see that woven through that. But I think one of the things we have become more and more persuaded by is that that may not be enough, and it may not be enough either, ever, or particularly in the current environment. And so what we wanted to do in planning the future was talk about a bit broader about where in which planning needs to change. And I guess there's 3 or 4 things I wanted to say. Firstly was there's a real point there, and some of what Deirdra has talked about earlier is a real pointer there about digital, in that, you know, I've got background in other British public services. Most of those are vastly more technologically advanced than planning. Planning feels like it is a really quite outdated service compared to getting your passport, making tax or benefit claims at the moment. We have got to move that up forward. And we've got to put some thinking, investment, whatever, into developing a much more digital planning offer, which is much more of offers more community engagement, gives much better customer service. And how that works, much more to be thought about on that one. But I think that is certainly where the front and centre in our minds, and I think that is something there. I think the second thing is that one of the reasons why planning can take so long is it is clogged out on too many little things and not enough on the big things. And I'm going to do one of my better defences of permitted development, which I know is sort of deeply unpopular in these sort of forums. But actually, one of the key reasons why we've been trying to take some of the smaller stuff out is to free up the resource to focus on the bigger stuff. And my ministers make no apologies for putting in more permitted development rights. We are absolutely clear on those. I think the most interesting one, which I think needs quite a bit of thinking and working through, is the opportunity to demolish and rebuild direct commercial industrial spaces. I think that's quite an interesting way of, I think it could come into its own potentially in a market where there's some depressed prices, and we need to get those empty buildings repurposed as quickly as possible. Some really quite interesting things there, but how to make it actually usable, how to make it in a way that it leads to great products. Really interesting territory discussion there. I think the third thing I wanted to emphasise was the importance that we put in the planning for the future of taking some of the existing tools in the planning system and turbocharging them. So there is the nexus, which is getting plans in place, getting those plans to start from an honest assessment of housing and other needs, and then putting in it using a delivery test to sort of test whether we're actually doing it there, and having these looping back. Using those and actually making them work properly is a real key part of that story. And I think that in the next 3-4 years is going to be where we're going to really get things going. There are real challenges to getting plans in place in some parts of the country, but I don't think that there is any sort of lack of ambition to do that in government. And I want to be very clear on that. And then the final bit I just wanted to, well, actually 2 final bits before I let Faraz come in. First is about design. And that one of the things we do need still to respond to is the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission report. We do not see there's a difference between the planning reform and the better design agenda. You know, we have a current planning system which gets, you know, you should read the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission report to see how even in the current world we are delivering some design outcomes which are suboptimal. So we've got to be able to get better at that. And then the final thing to say is one of the things we deliberately opened up, and one of the reasons why we have been, we wanted to be, and we will take probably a bit longer, who knows when we'll publish, is we wanted to ask ourselves some big questions about the future of the planning system. Can we give more certainty? Can we give more predictability about decision making? You know, a lot of the feedback we get from all sides is the seemingly random nature, as it feels to some people, of planning decision making, and can we get more certainty into that process? And that is a deliberate effort to open up those questions. And I think that is a really key part of what we want to do there. Is there a way in which we can give more certainty, more predictability, and at the same time as meeting our aspirations for the nation? And I think we've deliberately opened those questions, and that is an area where there's a really productive and very quite big picture and strategic question for those involved in development in England to open up. And I'll stop there.
Well, you've opened up a lot then. I've got literally probably 8 minutes left of this time on the ticking machine. But what I'm going to do is, and you didn't answer the question, I need you to give me a one-word period: summer, spring, autumn, or winter. When are we going to see some of these provisions outlined in the Planning for the Future paper? Are we still on track for the timescale in your view? So will we see, for example, PD rights come forward in the summer, the planning white paper, springtime? Is that all still on track? Give me a sense on time very quickly.
You can't ask me 5 questions, get a one-word answer. PD rights, pretty much we may end up a week or 2 out because of the current circumstances, but you know, that's fine. White paper, don't know is the honest thing. It's, you know, it wouldn't feel like the right thing to publish something in the current world at the moment. There's some higher priorities, so some of this depends on how long we are in the current environment.
So, and I'm going to now just ask my panelists very quickly. So Deirdre, I'm going to ask you very simply, are we going to see a flood of Article 4s from your colleagues to block these PD rights as they come shining through the planning system? Becky, I want you to give me a sense of what certainty looks like, because that Pandora's box open, and particularly from a BTR world, you must be very disappointed. It was very silent. It felt more home ownership, the planning reforms, than the BTR-led one. And then I'm going to go to
silent
Claire
on most forms of housing as well, actually.
And then I'm going to come to Claire to give me a wrap up on what, you know, from your lens, you know, what's missing and what you'd like to see come through in that white paper that we haven't seen. So perhaps Deirdre first. You know, it's all about performance and measures on you really as a local authority. That's what this is really about, isn't it?
Well, look, no, I think actually we need to, as Simon has said, it is about big strategic questions. You know, inbuilt into that paper are things that I think have really crystallized for us. It's all about housing, it's about homes, it's about neighborhoods, it's about doing them properly, you know, them being things that communities can, you know, feel attached to, and you know, will look after in the long term. We all know the value of open space. You know, our homes at the moment, I mean, you know, it's crystal clear, isn't it? So the ambition to make that better, for everyone to reach out for that and have homes and good neighborhoods where they can, you know, do their shopping, etc. You know, our world has shrunk right now, and it has taught us the value of the local. And having said that, you know, the practicalities of how you do it, you know, Simon has touched on it, you know, with regard to the provisions around local plan and insisting that that big picture is there. I think the real problem the system's had for 20 years is that people get involved in the decision-making end point, and they're not as enabled probably by us to get into, you know, the idea of what do you want your neighborhood, your locality to look like. Let's, you know, answer those questions at the outset. We can flow through then the decision-making processes, you know, technically in a relatively straightforward way. But we're encouraging the debate at the wrong end of the programme. And that's why there is no certainty or predictability in it, because it comes at the wrong point. I also think that in the current circumstances, local plans need to have an ability to have, if you like, addendums made to them so that they can reflect perhaps a meanwhile position over the next 2 years that goes to that issue around viability and so on, and that, you know, we have flexibility in it, because local plans are not flexible. And just to go to your Article 4 point, again, I think that relates to my big point is, you know, if everyone's bought into the local plan, you wouldn't necessarily need a plethora of Article 4s. And I think they are, they're not necessarily an authentic way to deal with this issue. We have to be able to sell the story of building homes, enabling people to stay where they are by expanding where they are. And that's what the PD measures are designed to do. And maybe we have to sell that story first before we get to a last resort on an Article 4.
I can't disagree with anything you just said. Absolutely a 10 out of 10 answer, honestly.
Very good. Well done.
Brilliant. Rebecca, certainty. What do you want? And from your lens, have you got enough in the machinery for planning reform you wanted to see?
Well, look, as you mentioned, I think we were all disappointed to sort of see some silence around build to rent. I appreciate there's a push for home ownership, but we're in a situation where as a country, we need more homes and more housing. And, one of the points in the reform paper was to explore wider options to accelerate build out rates. And I think, I mentioned before that build to rent is counter-cyclical. I think that's definitely where we can start to see, the value add of build to rent coming forward. There's a question here about, is the build to rent model sustainable post-COVID given the limited access to amenity space? Yeah. I think I kind of mentioned this quite a lot in that there seems to be a misnomer about what build to rent is, that it's kind of expensive apartments with lovely amenity and, and that's about it. And I think, as a sector, we've got to do a better position at, better piece at positioning and taking communities and the local authorities through what build to rent is. I mean, as long-term holders, we're very interested and driven by optimal design and making sure that, our customers can move out at any point. So it's much more intrinsically focused for us in terms of, the design side of things and making sure that people are comfortable in their homes. We always design their homes and their flats first, and then the amenity is the additional, add-on piece. I think there's also benefits, at the moment on the build to rent on how it can work, not just on amenity, but also in terms of community. People might not be able to access their amenity space at the moment, but, we're doing things in terms of online communities, online quizzes, addressing loneliness, putting people in the buildings in contact with each other. And that's something that, other investors may not be aligned with. But I definitely think, going forward, the local plans, I think there needs to be a drive to include build to rent within the local plans. I think, it's just as essential and a need. It's not just it's also a choice for people as well. It's not just people who can't afford to get on the planning ladder. So I think that would be something interesting. I think also, having a look and helping local authorities with resource. So maybe there's a build to rent champion that developers and investors pay for to help, hold hands for local authorities and to help try and fast track that process. And then I think as I mentioned before, just continued recognition that I think in the moment build to rent it has an opportunity to shine and to kind of help get started with the housing delivery as soon as possible. I don't think there'll be as much as a lag. So I think there's also an emphasis on us as the private sector to really try and get that across as well.
And really what you want is a champion to help, rather like someone working in an Atlas or a Homes England expert that can help across authorities is one of the sort of takeaways I got.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned, I think it's about communication for build to rent and, what it is. And sometimes people see it as a dark art. So if there's a champion that's working on the local authority side to help the sector and to help shape all of those requirements, I think, we would welcome that as the private sector as well. I mean, there's plenty that, we can go on to in terms of the renters reform and also understanding from MHCLG's perspective, what the protection for renters is going to be, post COVID-19 and those people, building up rents and debts as well. I think, that's something probably for another day, conscious of time.
And I'm mindful David's prodding me virtually in the back as well, as in Lee is. So Claire, just as a sort of wrap up on what we've heard, I take away there's a lot of good communication going on between the public and private sector. Viability remains a big issue. Lots of questions around viability, lots of issues around, how can we keep schemes going under this current environment. But from your sense, Claire, have we got enough in the tank in both the PFF and the emergency measures that we've heard this morning?
Well, I think regarding plan for the future, the first point is it's difficult to believe that this document came out only 1 month ago. It just seems like another lifetime. But I think there's not, from my perspective and my client's perspective, there's not a lot to dislike about it. There's a lot of sensible, good stuff in there. But it's I have to be honest and say it's not particularly radical. I think the radical stuff was to be left with this mysterious white paper that nobody really knows what was going to be in it. It's going to be bold and ambitious, but who knows what was going to come forward in that. But just picking up on a few of the measures, PD rights for upwards only extensions, yeah, great, provided it doesn't infringe daylight and sunlighting. But again, an idea that's been knocking around for the last few years. Setting a deadline for local authorities to have a plan in place by 2023. How many times have we seen deadlines for plans? But yeah, again, commendable. Establishing a national brownfield map. I have to say I'm a bit confused about that one, given all the time and effort we've all spent on brownfield registers and getting them up and going. So not sure about that, but a novel idea. Developers getting their planning application fee back if they win at an appeal, and I'm sure my developer clients would be happy to receive that. They're not going to knock back the money, but I have to be honest and say they want the system resourced properly, and that isn't a main driver cutting costs of the planning application process. And that's shown by the fact that many of our clients will spend thousands of pounds under PPAs to ensure that the system is resourced and they do get the decisions. And at the end of the day, the planning application fee at an appeal is, let's face it, peanuts compared to the amount that is spent on barristers and expensive lawyers like us and witnesses, etc. So it's good stuff, but you know, topics that have been talked about for a while. In the planning white paper, I know it's a cliche, but what I would like to see is a long, hard look at the Greenbelt release, particularly at this moment in time. And I think that would be radical to have a grown-up conversation about the Greenbelt. But that's for another day.
A planning political white paper.
Yes,
so,
yeah.
A slightly different white paper. But listen, you know, we've had some great questions. Richard Osborne, who wanted to know, you know, city mayors like Andy Street, should he get the same planning powers like the Mayor of London? Of course he should. He's a brilliant mayor and he should get all the powers he needs to develop his region. But listen, can I thank everybody in the panel in the usual way? I'm doing that virtually for 500 people. And can I pass over to Lee, who will do the wrap up for us? Over to Lee.
Thank you very much, Faraz, and thank you to our panel. Well, that was a really fascinating and insightful discussion, and there's clearly lots to consider. It's evident that the government do want to improve the planning process, and obviously we need to have some sort of quick thinking to get us out of the position we're in at the moment and through these challenging times. If developers, clearly, and government and local authorities work together, I'm sure we'll be able to kickstart construction and planning indeed. But thank you so much to our panel. Well, as I said earlier, we've got a series of Movers and Shakers virtual events coming up over the next couple of months. We have recorded today's event, and we are recording going forward. These will all be found later on our YouTube channel for Movers and Shakers, so please do subscribe. We'd like your feedback and your ideas for future events. You can register on moversandshakers.uk.com for all events, so do go online and take a look. Our next event will be this Friday at 10:30, and it'll be one of our market insight sessions. We've got Ben Page, who is Chief Executive of Ipsos Mori. He will be talking about UK Unlocked. How will society and business change? So that's going to be a fascinating session. So please do register, please do watch. We really hope you've enjoyed this morning. From all of us, please do keep safe, and thank you from our family to yours. Thank you.